The sirens were screaming through the night when I saw her for the first time. A small orange tabby cat, pressed against a third-floor window, her tiny paws frantically scratching at the glass as flames danced behind her like demons from hell. The smoke was so thick I could barely make out her silhouette, but her eyes, God, her eyes were looking right at me through that window, pleading for someone, anyone, to save her from what seemed like certain death. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about courage, about love, and about the incredible bond between humans and animals. Because that little cat didn't just survive that night. She did something so extraordinary, so completely unexpected, that it left an entire neighborhood speechless and brought tears to the eyes of hardened firefighters who thought they'd seen everything. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? My name is Sarah, and I've been a firefighter for 15 years. But to understand why that night changed my life forever, I need to take you back to the beginning, to a small town called Millbrook, nestled in the mountains of Colorado, where the air was always crisp and clean, and the biggest excitement we ever had was when old Mr. Henderson's barn caught fire from lightning strikes during summer storms. I grew up in a house that smelled like pine trees and my mother's cinnamon rolls, where my father's fire gear hung by the back door like a soldier's uniform waiting for battle. My father was the fire chief there, a man whose hands were permanently stained with engine grease, and whose eyes held the weight of every life he'd saved and every one he couldn't. My earliest memories are of sitting on his lap in the cab of Engine 7, my small hands gripping the steering wheel while he told me stories about brave firefighters who saved people and animals from danger. The smell of diesel fuel and leather from his gear still takes me back to those moments when I was small, and the world seemed full of heroes who could fix anything, save anyone, make everything right again. Dad would let me play with his helmet after particularly long shifts, the yellow plastic still warm from the heat of whatever fire he'd just fought. I'd march around the house wearing it, the thing so big it covered my eyes, pretending I was rushing off to save the day. Mom would laugh and take pictures, never imagining that her little girl would actually grow up to run toward burning buildings for a living. Our house sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, surrounded by aspens and pines that turned the yard into a cathedral of green and gold every autumn. We had a barn where Dad kept his classic Mustang and Mom stored her gardening tools, and a wraparound porch where we'd sit on summer evenings listening to the sounds of the mountains settling in for the night. It was the kind of childhood that people write songs about. All wide open spaces and unconditional love, and the absolute certainty that your parents could protect you from anything the world might throw your way. But even in that idyllic setting, I was drawn to the darker stories, the ones where someone was in trouble and needed saving. When Dad came home from calls, I'd pepper him with questions about what had happened, who had been hurt, whether everyone was okay. Other kids wanted bedtime stories about princesses and dragons. I wanted to hear about the family whose house caught fire on Christmas Eve, and how Dad and his crew had managed to save not just the people, but all the presents under the tree. I was 8 years old when I decided I wanted to be just like him. It was a cold December morning, the kind where the snow squeaks under your boots and your breath forms clouds that hang in the air like ghosts. Our neighbor's house had caught fire from a faulty space heater, and I watched from our front yard as my dad and his crew worked tirelessly to put out the flames. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero the night before, and everything outside was covered in a thick layer of frost that made the world look like it was made of crystal. The fire hoses created steam clouds that drifted across the yard like fog, and the firefighters looked like knights in their bulky gear, moving through the mist with purpose and determination. I remember thinking that this was what real heroes looked like. Not the superheroes in comic books, but ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone needed help. But what I remember most wasn't the fire, or the smoke, or the chaos. It was the moment when my dad emerged from that burning house carrying Mrs. Peterson's elderly cat, Whiskers, who had been hiding under a bed on the second floor. The cat was barely conscious from smoke inhalation, his gray fur singed and his breathing labored. Mrs. Peterson was crying and thanking my dad over and over. But he just smiled and gently placed Whiskers in her arms before rushing back to help with the remaining hot spots. That cat had been her only companion since her husband died 3 years earlier, and losing him would have broken her heart completely. I watched as she held Whiskers against her chest, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air, whispering his name over and over. The paramedics gave the cat oxygen through a tiny mask, and slowly, very slowly, his breathing improved. By the time the fire was completely out, Whiskers was purring weakly in Mrs. Peterson's arms. Watching my father risk his life to save something that mattered so much to another person, that's when I knew what I wanted to do with my life. It wasn't just about the fire or the rescue. It was about understanding that love comes in many forms, and that sometimes saving what someone loves most is just as important as saving the person themselves. That night, I saw my father save Mrs. Peterson twice. Once by rescuing her cat, and again by preserving the relationship that gave her life meaning. I carried that lesson with me through high school, where I was the kid who brought injured birds to the science teacher and organized fundraisers for the animal shelter. I carried it through my time at Colorado State University, where I studied fire science and spent my weekends volunteering with the local search and rescue team. And I carried it through the grueling months at the Fire Academy, where I learned that being small and female in a male-dominated profession meant I had to work twice as hard to prove myself. The academy was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Physical training that left me exhausted and sore. Classroom work that demanded perfect recall of procedures and protocols. Practical exercises that tested not just your knowledge, but your ability to think clearly under pressure. There were 43 people in my class when we started, and only 29 graduated. Every day, someone would decide they couldn't handle the heat, the danger, the responsibility of holding other people's lives in their hands. But every time I felt like giving up, I remembered Mrs. Peterson's face when she held her rescued cat. And I knew this was where I belonged. I studied harder than everyone else, trained longer than everyone else, pushed myself further than I thought possible. I had to prove that I belonged there, that size and gender were no match for determination and heart. I moved to Denver when I was 22, fresh out of the Fire Academy, eager to make a difference in a big city where the calls were more frequent and the stakes felt higher. The Denver Fire Department assigned me to Station 19, located in a diverse neighborhood where old Victorian houses stood next to modern apartment complexes, where families who had lived there for generations mixed with young professionals and college students. The station itself was a beautiful old brick building that had been constructed in 1925, with brass poles that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight and apparatus bay doors that opened onto a busy street lined with coffee shops and ethnic restaurants. The neighborhood had character, tree-lined streets with sidewalks where kids rode bicycles and old men played chess in the park. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' names and looked out for each other's children. The crew at Station 19 had been working together for years, and they welcomed me with the kind of good-natured hazing that let me know I was being accepted into their brotherhood. They tested me in small ways at first, asking me to carry the heaviest equipment, giving me the worst sleeping quarters, making me prove that I could keep up with their pace and their standards. But it was never mean-spirited. They just needed to know that they could count on me when lives were on the line. Captain Martinez was a 25-year veteran with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen everything the job could throw at him. He'd grown up in the neighborhood we protected, and he knew every building, every family, every potential hazard within our district. His knowledge wasn't just professional, it was personal. These weren't just addresses on a map to him. They were places where real people lived real lives, and he felt responsible for all of them. Lieutenant Johnson was quieter, but equally experienced, with a gift for reading fire behavior that bordered on supernatural. He could look at a building and tell you exactly how the fire would spread, where it would be weakest, where the greatest dangers lay. Other firefighters joked that he could smell trouble before it started, but I learned that his intuition was really just decades of experience distilled into split-second decision-making. Mike Torres was the youngest of the veterans, only 5 years older than me, but already legendary for his ability to navigate smoke-filled buildings like he had built-in radar. He'd grown up in East Denver, and joining the fire department had been his way of giving back to communities like the one that had raised him. Mike had a gift for connecting with people in crisis, for saying exactly the right thing to calm someone down or give them hope. It was a challenging assignment for a rookie. Urban fires were different from the rural blazes I'd grown up around. They spread faster, burned hotter, and put more lives at risk. The buildings were taller, the occupancy loads higher, the potential for tragedy exponentially greater. House fires in the city meant multiple families at risk instead of just one. Apartment fires could displace dozens of people in a matter of minutes. But I loved the work, loved the adrenaline rush of racing through the city streets with sirens blaring, loved the satisfaction of making a real difference in people's lives during their worst moments. There's something about emergency work that strips away all the meaningless complications of daily life and reduces everything to its essence. Someone needs help, and you have the skills and equipment to provide it. My first few months at Station 19 were a blur of learning experiences. I fought kitchen fires in cramped apartments where smoke detectors had been removed because they went off every time someone cooked. I helped evacuate office buildings when electrical fires filled stairwells with toxic smoke. I cut people out of cars after accidents, treated overdose victims in dark alleys, and responded to medical emergencies that ranged from heart attacks to domestic violence calls. But it was the animal rescues that always affected me most deeply. There was something about the absolute trust an animal placed in you when they were terrified and trapped that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession. Dogs who had been locked in apartments during fires, cats who had climbed too high in trees and couldn't get down, horses who had been trapped in barn fires. Each rescue reinforced my belief that every life, no matter how small, was worth saving. The other firefighters at Station 19 started calling me the Animal Whisperer because I volunteered for every call involving animals. I kept dog treats and cat treats in my gear bag, learned how to approach frightened animals without spooking them further, and developed a reputation for being able to coax even the most terrified creatures to safety. Captain Martinez used to joke that I should have been a veterinarian instead of a firefighter, but I knew this was exactly where I belonged. The intersection of emergency services and animal welfare felt like my calling, even though I had no idea how profound that calling would become. Looking back now, I think the universe was preparing me for something specific, training me for a moment when all my skills and instincts would be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. I spent my off-duty hours studying animal behavior, reading about how trauma affects different species, learning techniques for calming frightened animals in emergency situations. My apartment was filled with books about veterinary medicine, animal psychology, and the human-animal bond. My fellow firefighters thought I was obsessed, but I felt like I was preparing for something important, even if I didn't know what it was yet. The call came in at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. I remember the exact time because I was just finishing a late dinner in the station kitchen, reading a book about animal behavior while I ate leftover pizza that Mike had ordered earlier. The station was quiet except for the soft sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of city traffic. It was the kind of peaceful evening that makes you almost forget that somewhere out there, people are having the worst nights of their lives. I had been thinking about calling my parents, who still lived in that little house in Millbrook where I'd grown up. Dad had retired from the fire department the year before, and Mom had been sending me care packages filled with homemade cookies and newspaper clippings about local news. I miss the simplicity of small-town life sometimes. The way everyone knew everyone and problems felt manageable and contained. The alarm shattered that peace with its piercing electronic wail. "Structure fire," the dispatcher announced, her voice crisp and professional. 847 Maple Street, possible occupants trapped inside. Multiple units responding, reports of people jumping from windows. The last part sent ice through my veins. When people start jumping from windows, it means the fire has cut off all other escape routes. It means desperation has overcome the natural fear of falling. It means we're racing against time in the most literal sense possible. We were suited up and rolling within 90 seconds. But those 90 seconds felt like an eternity. Pulling on gear, checking equipment, running through mental checklists of everything we might need. The routine was so automatic after months of practice that my hands moved without conscious thought. But my mind was already racing ahead to what we might find when we arrived on scene. Captain Martinez was driving, his weathered hands steady on the wheel as he navigated through the narrow streets of our district. The autumn air was crisp that night, with a hint of winter coming, and the leaves on the maple trees lining the street had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. It would have been beautiful if we weren't racing toward what we knew could be a tragedy. The radio crackled with updates from other responding units. First engine on scene reports heavy fire showing from second and third floors. Ladder truck establishing water supply. Battalion chief requesting additional units. Possible victims on ground. Paramedics needed immediately. The calm, professional language couldn't hide the urgency underneath. This was a working fire, and working fires meant people's lives were in immediate danger. As we got closer, I could see the glow on the horizon, that orange light that firefighters know means a building is fully involved. It painted the low-hanging clouds with an eerie light that made the whole neighborhood look like it was trapped inside a Halloween decoration. The smell of smoke was getting stronger too, that acrid scent of burning plastic and wood, and all the materials that make up modern life. When we turned onto Maple Street, I could see the orange glow before I could see the building. Thick black smoke was pouring from the windows of a 3-story apartment building, and flames were already visible on the second floor, reaching out through broken windows like grasping fingers. The fire was moving fast, eating through the old building with terrifying efficiency. Neighbors were gathered on the sidewalk in their pajamas and robes, some crying, some talking frantically on their phones, all of them looking up at the building with expressions of horror and helplessness. Children clung to their parents' legs, wide-eyed and confused by the chaos. Elderly residents sat on portable chairs that someone had brought from nearby apartments, wrapped in blankets and watching their neighbors' lives go up in smoke. I could see people I recognized from previous calls. Mrs. Rodriguez from the grocery store on the corner, Mr. Kim who ran the dry cleaner 2 blocks over, families I'd met during community events at the station. This wasn't just a building to me. It was home to people I'd come to know and care about over the past year. The building itself was a classic Denver apartment house from the 1920s, 3 stories of red brick with decorative cornices and large windows that had probably been beautiful when they weren't framing an inferno. Fire was showing from at least 6 windows, and smoke was pouring from everywhere else. The structure was fully involved, which meant we were in a race against time before the whole thing became too dangerous to enter. Captain Martinez began coordinating with the other crews that were arriving on scene. The building was old, built in the 1920s, with narrow hallways and wooden staircases that would act like chimneys once the fire really got going. Most of the residents had already evacuated, but there were reports of at least 3 people still inside, including an elderly woman on the 3rd floor who used a wheelchair and might have had trouble getting out on her own. I could see the incident commander setting up his command post near Engine 7, using the truck's radio system to coordinate the response. Ladder trucks were positioning themselves for potential rescues from upper floor windows. Paramedics were establishing a treatment area for any victims we might bring out. The controlled chaos of a major fire response was unfolding around us with practiced precision. The night air was filled with the sounds of emergency response. Diesel engines roaring, air horns honking, radio chatter crackling between units. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. The sound of the fire itself, a low roar that seemed to come from the building's very bones. It was the sound of destruction, of everything someone had worked for being consumed in minutes. I was assigned to the interior attack team with Lieutenant Johnson and Firefighter Mike Torres. Our job was to search the upper floors for any remaining occupants while other crews worked to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading to neighboring buildings. The weight of our equipment felt familiar and reassuring as we made our way toward the front entrance. Oxygen tank, helmet, axe, flashlight, radio. Everything I needed to do my job and come home safely at the end of the shift. The front entrance of the building was an ornate affair from the 1920s, with carved stone details and brass mailboxes that spoke of a time when this had been a prestigious address. Now smoke was pouring from the doorway like water from a broken dam, and the heat radiating from inside was intense enough to feel through our protective gear. The lobby was already thick with smoke when we entered the building. The heat hit us like a physical wall, even through our protective gear. It was the kind of heat that makes you instantly aware of every piece of exposed skin, that seems to find its way through the smallest gaps in your equipment. Visibility was down to maybe 3 feet, and the sound of the fire above us was a constant roar, like standing next to a waterfall made of destruction. We stayed low, following the wall to find the staircase, communicating through hand signals because the noise made radio communication almost impossible. The floor beneath our feet was already hot enough that I could feel it through my boots, and the air was filled with particles of ash and debris that made breathing difficult even with our SCBA systems. The lobby had probably been beautiful once, with marble floors and decorative plaster on the ceiling. Now it was a hellscape of smoke and heat, with pieces of burning debris falling like snow. I could see family photos scattered on the floor, knocked down in the chaos of evacuation, their glass frames reflecting the orange glow of the flames above. The staircase was a narrow wooden affair that creaked ominously under our weight. Each step felt like a small act of faith that the structure would hold together long enough for us to complete our search and get back out. The handrail was too hot to touch, even through our gloves, and the walls were radiating heat like a furnace. As we climbed, I could hear the building talking to us. The groans and creaks and pops that old structures make when they're being stressed beyond their limits. Wood was expanding and contracting, metal was heating up and bending, and somewhere above us, things were falling down. It was like being inside a living thing that was slowly dying. First floor clear. We moved methodically through each apartment, calling out, listening for responses, checking closets and bathrooms, and anywhere a person might be hiding or trapped. The apartments were filled with the detritus of normal life. Family photos on mantels, children's toys scattered on floors, kitchen tables set for meals that would never be finished. It was heartbreaking to see these intimate spaces violated by fire and smoke. In apartment 1B, I found a fish tank with tropical fish swimming frantically in water that was already starting to warm from the heat. In 1C, there was a parakeet in a cage, squawking with terror. Temporary homes for any animals we rescued. I opened the fish tank and carried the bird cage out to the paramedics, who promised to find temporary homes for any animals we rescued. Second floor. We found an elderly man named Harold who had gotten disoriented in the smoke and couldn't find his way out. He was sitting on his couch, confused and frightened, clutching a photo of what looked like his late wife. The apartment was filling with smoke, and he was already showing signs of smoke inhalation, confusion, difficulty breathing, a grayish pallor that meant his oxygen levels were dropping. Mike and Lieutenant Johnson got him to safety, while I continued up to the third floor to search for the woman in the wheelchair. Harold kept asking about his cat, a tabby named Chester who had run and hidden when the fire alarms started going off. We promised to look for Chester, but our priority had to be getting Harold out before the smoke overcame him completely. The heat was getting more intense with each step, and I could feel sweat pouring down my face inside my mask. My breathing was steady but labored, and I was constantly monitoring my air supply and my physical condition. Heat exhaustion was a real danger in these conditions, and pushing too hard could mean becoming a victim myself. Third floor was like stepping into hell itself. The hallway was a tunnel of smoke and flame, and the wooden floor was starting to buckle under my feet. I could hear the fire eating away at the structure of the building, could feel the whole place starting to shift and settle in ways that made my stomach clench with fear. Buildings talk to you when they're dying, and this one was screaming that it didn't have much time left. The wallpaper in the hallway was curling and blackening from the heat, and I could see flames licking at the ceiling above my head. The smoke was so thick that my flashlight beam only penetrated a few inches, and I was navigating mostly by feel and memory. Each door I opened revealed another glimpse into someone's life being destroyed. Bedrooms with children's drawings on the walls, kitchens with dinner dishes still in the sink, living rooms where families had gathered to watch television just hours before. I found the elderly woman, Mrs. Chun, in apartment 3B. She was conscious, but trapped in her wheelchair next to her bed, unable to move because fallen debris had blocked her path to the door. A section of the ceiling had come down, not enough to injure her seriously, but enough to pin her wheelchair against the wall. She looked at me with enormous relief when I appeared in her doorway, her eyes bright with tears and hope. Mrs. Chun was probably in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my own grandmother. She was wearing a pink nightgown and clutching a small purse that she'd obviously grabbed when the evacuation started. When she saw me, she started speaking rapidly in what sounded like Mandarin, then switched to accented English. Thank you. I thought no one would come. It took me several minutes to clear the debris and get her safely out of the apartment and down to the second floor, where other firefighters took over and got her the rest of the way to safety. Mrs. Chun was remarkably calm throughout the process, thanking me repeatedly in accented English and telling me about her children who lived in California and would be so worried when they heard about the fire. As I was helping Mrs. Chun, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said something that made my heart sink. There's a cat. In 3A. Orange cat. Lives in the alley, but comes inside when it's cold. She might be trapped. That's when I heard it. A sound that cut through all the noise of the fire, all the shouting and radio chatter and mechanical groaning of a building in distress. It was high-pitched and desperate, and unmistakably the cry of an animal in terror. I followed the sound back up to the third floor, moving as quickly as I could while still being careful about the increasingly unstable floor. My air supply was getting low, and I knew I only had a few more minutes before I would have to evacuate regardless of what I found. But that crying was so desperate, so full of fear and pain, that I couldn't abandon whatever creature was making it. The sound was getting louder as I moved down the hallway, and I could tell it was coming from behind one of the doors. The crying was constant now, a high-pitched wail that spoke of absolute terror. Whatever animal was making that sound was trapped and knew it, was calling out for help with every breath. The crying was coming from apartment 3A, right next to where I'd found Mrs. Chun. The door was locked, and I could see light flickering underneath it, which meant the fire had already reached this unit. I tried the handle first, hoping against hope that it would turn, but it was definitely locked. A few swings of my axe took care of that problem, the steel blade biting through the wooden door frame with satisfying chunks. Inside the apartment, the smoke was so thick I couldn't see my hand in front of my face even with my flashlight. The heat was overwhelming, and I knew I only had a few minutes before the floor gave way, or the ceiling came down, or both. The apartment was laid out similarly to Mrs. Chen's, but the fire had advanced much further here. I could see flames licking at the walls, and the smoke was so dense it was like trying to navigate through black cotton. The temperature in the room had to be over 200 degrees. I could feel it through every layer of my protective equipment, and I knew that any unprotected skin would be burned in seconds. The smoke was toxic too, filled with chemicals from burning plastics and synthetic materials that could kill in minutes even with breathing apparatus. I followed the sound of crying to the back of the apartment, where a large window looked out over the street. The noise was coming from somewhere near the window, but I couldn't pinpoint the exact location through the smoke. I swept my flashlight back and forth, calling out in what I hoped was a reassuring voice. But the crying continued, high-pitched and desperate. The window was partially open, which explained how the cat might have gotten in, but it was too high and narrow for a safe escape. Below the window, the drop was 3 stories to concrete sidewalk. Certain death for any animal, no matter how agile. The cat was truly trapped, with no way out except through the fire. And that's where I saw her. The little orange tabby was crouched on the windowsill, pressing herself against the glass, her mouth open in silent cries that I couldn't hear over the roar of the fire. She was small, maybe 6 or 7 pounds, with bright orange fur marked by darker stripes and a white patch on her chest that looked like a tiny bib. Her green eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the flames behind me like tiny emeralds, and she was shaking so hard I could see it even through the smoke. She was the most beautiful cat I'd ever seen, even covered in soot and terrified beyond measure. Her fur was long and fluffy, the kind that would be soft to touch under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and every instinct she had was telling her to run, even though there was nowhere to run to. The window was her only escape route, but it was a 3-story drop to the concrete sidewalk below. She was trapped, just like Mrs. Chun had been, but unlike Mrs. Chun, this little cat had no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know she was there. She had probably been hiding during the initial evacuation, too frightened by the noise and chaos to come when anyone called. I could see scratch marks on the windowsill where her claws had been digging for purchase, trying to find some way to climb higher, to get away from the heat and smoke that was filling the room. But there was nowhere to go, and she was smart enough to know that jumping meant death. I tried to approach her slowly, speaking in what I hoped was a calm, reassuring voice, but she was too frightened to trust me. Every time I reached toward her, she pressed herself further against the window, as if she was trying to push herself through the glass to safety. I could see her tiny claws scratching frantically at the window pane, leaving little marks in the condensation that had formed from the heat and smoke. Her eyes never left mine as I approached, and I could see intelligence there, along with the fear. This wasn't just a panicked animal acting on instinct. This was a creature who understood her situation, who knew she was trapped, who was looking at me and trying to decide whether this strange figure in bulky gear could possibly be trusted to help her. The floor beneath my feet was getting softer, and I could hear ominous creaking sounds from the ceiling above. Bits of plaster were falling like snow, and I could see the wallpaper starting to curl and blacken from the heat. I had maybe 2 minutes before this whole section of the building came down, and this terrified little cat was the only thing standing between me and getting out of there alive. My training told me to leave. Protocol dictated that I evacuate immediately when conditions became this dangerous. But looking at those green eyes, seeing the absolute terror in her small face, I knew I couldn't abandon her. She was depending on me to save her, just like Mrs. Chun had been, just like every person I'd ever pulled from a burning building. I made a decision that went against every protocol I'd ever learned. I took off my thick protective gloves so I could have better dexterity, even though it meant my hands were now exposed to the heat and potential burns. The metal clasp on my glove caught briefly, precious seconds ticking away while I fumbled with equipment that suddenly felt clumsy and oversized. The moment my hands were free, I could feel the intense heat on my skin. It was like holding my palms over a campfire, painful but not yet damaging. I knew I only had seconds before the exposure became dangerous, but I needed the sensitivity and dexterity that only bare hands could provide. Then I reached out very slowly toward the cat, talking to her in the softest voice I could manage given the circumstances. "It's okay, little one. I'm here to help you. We're going to get out of here together. I know you're scared, but I'm going to take care of you." The cat looked at me with those incredible green eyes, and for just a moment, something seemed to shift in her expression. The wild panic was still there, but underneath it, I saw something that looked almost like hope, like she was trying to decide whether this strange creature in the bulky gear and mask could actually be trusted to save her. I could see her nostrils flaring as she tried to smell me through the smoke and ash. Cats rely heavily on scent to identify threats and allies, and I knew that my gear and the environment were masking any comforting human smells she might normally recognize. I was a stranger in strange clothing, approaching her in the most terrifying situation of her life. I moved my hand very slowly toward her, palm up, fingers relaxed. The heat in the room was becoming unbearable, and I could feel my exposed skin starting to burn. But I forced myself to move slowly and calmly. Sudden movements would only frighten her more, and if she bolted deeper into the apartment, I'd never be able to find her in time. She sniffed at my fingers, and I felt the whisper of her breath against my skin. It was such a small, gentle sensation in the middle of all that chaos and destruction, and it reminded me why I'd become a firefighter in the first place. Not for the adrenaline or the heroics, but for moments like this, when you could make the difference between life and death for someone who couldn't save themselves. Her whiskers brushed against my fingertips, and I could feel how soft they were, how delicate. This little creature was so fragile, so vulnerable, and yet she was fighting to survive with everything she had. The courage it must have taken for her to stay conscious and alert in this environment, to keep looking for a way out instead of giving up, was extraordinary. The cat let me touch her head very gently, just the tips of my fingers against her fur. She was so soft, even matted with soot and smoke, and so warm. I could feel her tiny heart beating incredibly fast, like a hummingbird's wings. Her fur was damp with condensation and fear, and there were little bits of ash and debris stuck in her coat. Gradually, moving as slowly as I could force myself to move with the building literally falling apart around us, I slipped my hands around her small body and lifted her away from the window. She was lighter than I expected, all bone and muscle under that fluffy coat, and she trembled in my hands like a leaf in a windstorm. The moment I lifted her, I could feel how terrified she was. Her whole body was shaking, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. But there was something else too, a quality of trust, as if she had made a conscious decision to let me help her despite every instinct telling her to run. She didn't fight me. Instead, she pressed herself against my chest and began making a sound I'd never heard from a cat before. It wasn't quite purring, wasn't quite crying, but something in between. A sound of resignation mixed with trust, as if she was saying, "I don't know if you can save me, but I'm going to let you try." I tucked her inside my jacket, right against my chest, where she could hear my heartbeat and feel the rhythm of my breathing. She fit perfectly in the space between my gear and my body, as if she belonged there. Her small body was warm against me, and I could feel her breathing, rapid but steady, as she pressed herself as close to me as possible. Having her there, feeling her alive and trusting against my chest, gave me strength I didn't know I had. This wasn't just about following protocol or completing a mission anymore. This was about keeping a promise to a small creature who had chosen to trust me with her life. Then I started moving as fast as I dared toward the door, staying low to avoid the worst of the smoke, testing each step to make sure the floor would hold my weight. The apartment that had seemed small when I entered now felt enormous. Each step was a small victory, each breath a gift. Behind us, I could hear the sound of windows breaking as the heat built to unbearable levels. The hallway felt like it had doubled in length since I'd entered the apartment. The smoke was thicker now, and the heat was so intense that it felt like breathing through a furnace. My air alarm was starting to chirp, warning me that my oxygen supply was running dangerously low. Each step was a calculated risk, each second a gamble with both our lives. I could feel the building shifting around us, settling in ways that meant the structure was compromised. Somewhere above us, something heavy crashed to the floor. The ceiling in the hallway was starting to sag, and I knew we were cutting it very close. The little cat stayed perfectly still against my chest, as if she understood that any movement might throw off my balance or distract me from the careful navigation required to get us both out alive. I could feel her small body rise and fall with each breath, could feel the rapid beating of her heart against my ribs. In that moment, we were completely dependent on each other for survival. The staircase was the worst part. It was narrow and steep, and I could feel it swaying slightly under my weight. The metal railing was too hot to touch even through my remaining gear, so I had to feel my way down step by step, one hand on the wall, the other protecting the cat inside my jacket. Each step groaned under my boots, and I was constantly expecting to feel the whole structure give way beneath us. The smoke was so thick that I was navigating purely by memory and feel. I counted steps, feeling for the landing that would tell me I'd reach the next floor. Behind us, I could hear the sound of the fire growing stronger, eating through the building's structure with terrifying efficiency. I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears, the mechanical sound of the SCBA system working to keep me alive. But underneath that, I could hear the cat's breathing too, still rapid but steady. She was holding on, trusting me to get us both out of this nightmare. Second floor, first floor, and then, finally, the front door and the beautiful, cold October air. I stumbled out onto the sidewalk, my legs shaking from the adrenaline and exertion. The contrast between the suffocating heat inside the building and the cool night air was so stark that it felt like diving into a cold lake. I pulled off my mask and took deep, grateful breaths of clean air that tasted like freedom and life. The scene outside was controlled chaos. Fire trucks everywhere, their red and white lights painting the night in emergency colors. Paramedics treating residents for smoke inhalation. Police officers keeping the crowd back and directing traffic. The Red Cross setting up a shelter area for displaced families. The other firefighters rushed over to check on me, and the paramedics wanted to examine me for smoke inhalation and burns. My exposed hands were red and painful, and my lungs felt raw from the heat and smoke. But I was alive and functional. But all I could think about was the little cat pressed against my chest, still making that soft sound that was somewhere between purring and crying. Captain Martinez appeared at my side, his face a mixture of relief and exasperation. He'd been worried about me when I'd stayed inside longer than planned, and the professional in him wanted to lecture me about taking unnecessary risks. But the human in him understood why I'd done it, and I could see in his eyes that he was proud of the rescue. I unzipped my jacket carefully and lifted her out. She was covered in soot, her orange fur turned gray with smoke, but she was alive and alert. Her green eyes were still wide, but the panic was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like gratitude. She looked around at all the activity, the fire trucks, the firefighters, the crowd of neighbors, with what seemed like amazement. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk erupted in cheers when they saw her. Someone started clapping, and soon everyone was applauding, their faces lit up with joy despite the tragedy of the fire. It's amazing how the sight of one small life saved can restore people's faith in the possibility of good outcomes, even in the middle of disaster. But what happened next is what really shocked everyone, including me. Instead of running away or hiding, which is what most rescued animals do when they're overwhelmed and traumatized, this little cat did something extraordinary. She looked around at all the people gathered on the sidewalk, all the firefighters and paramedics and neighbors, and then she did something that made everyone fall silent. She walked over to Mrs. Chun, who was sitting in her wheelchair with an oxygen mask over her face, wrapped in a Red Cross blanket and looking frail and scared. The cat approached her slowly, deliberately, and then jumped up onto her lap and curled up there, purring loudly enough that everyone nearby could hear it. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up with one shaky hand to stroke the cat's fur. The cat leaned into her touch, continuing to purr, and for a moment the chaos around them seemed to fade away. It was as if this little animal understood that Mrs. Chun had also been rescued from a fire, that they were both survivors who had been given a second chance at life. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next hour, as the firefighters worked to fully extinguish the blaze, and the Red Cross set up temporary shelter for the displaced residents, that little orange cat moved from person to person in the crowd. She seemed to instinctively know who needed comfort most. She spent time with the young mother who was crying because she'd lost all her family photos in the fire. She sat quietly next to the elderly man, Harold, who was being treated for smoke inhalation, and kept asking about his own cat, Chester. She even approached some of my fellow firefighters who were taking a break, offering them the same gentle presence she'd given to everyone else. Mike Torres, who was usually reserved around animals, found himself petting her and talking about how remarkable she was. Lieutenant Johnson, who claimed he was allergic to cats, sat with her on his lap while he filled out incident reports. It was like watching a therapy animal at work, except this cat had no training, no handler, no prior experience with this kind of situation. She was operating purely on instinct, on some deep understanding of human emotion and need that seemed almost supernatural. Lieutenant Johnson, who had 30 years of experience and had seen every kind of emergency response imaginable, stood watching with his mouth slightly open. Mike Torres kept shaking his head and muttering about how he'd never seen anything like it. Even the paramedics, who were used to dealing with traumatized animals, were amazed by the cat's calm, purposeful behavior. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, one of the paramedics, told me later that she'd never seen an animal recover from trauma so quickly. Most animals rescued from fires are catatonic with fear for hours or days afterward. But this cat seemed to understand that she was safe now, and instead of focusing on her own trauma, she was helping others deal with theirs. Captain Martinez, who had seen everything in his 25 years with the department, stood next to me watching this little cat work her magic on the crowd. He shook his head in amazement and said something I'll never forget. "In all my years doing this job, I've never seen anything like that. It's like she knows exactly what everyone needs." As the night wore on and the immediate crisis passed, the question became what to do with the cat. Animal control had been called, and they were prepared to take her to the city shelter until her owner could be identified. But Mrs. Chun, who was being loaded into an ambulance to be checked for smoke inhalation, called out to me before they closed the doors. "That cat doesn't belong to anyone in the building," she said, her voice weak but clear. "She's been living in the alley behind the apartments for months. People leave food for her, but she's too scared to let anyone get close. Until tonight, I've never seen her approach a human being." So this little cat, who had just demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to comfort people in crisis, was actually a stray. She had been living on her own, fending for herself, surviving on the kindness of strangers who left food but couldn't earn her trust. Until the night when she had to choose between trusting a strange human or dying in a fire. The irony wasn't lost on me. This cat, who had just spent an hour providing comfort to traumatized humans, had herself been living as an outsider, too frightened to accept help or form connections. The fire that had nearly killed her had also broken down the barriers of fear and mistrust that had kept her isolated. Mrs. Chun continued from the ambulance. "I think she chose you. When she could have run away after you saved her, she stayed. She helped people. I think she knows you're the one who saved her, and she wants to stay with you." I made a decision that night that changed both our lives forever. I asked Captain Martinez if I could adopt her, if I could take her home with me instead of letting her go to the shelter. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and understanding. He knew that firefighters often form strong bonds with the animals they rescue, and he'd seen enough of those relationships work out well to give his blessing. The veterinarian who examined her at the emergency animal clinic said she was approximately 2 years old, in good health despite her ordeal, and showed no signs of being microchipped or having previous owners. She had clearly been living as a stray for some time, but she was well-nourished enough to suggest that people in the neighborhood had been taking care of her from a distance. Dr. Rebecca Martinez at the all-night animal hospital was amazed by the cat's calm demeanor during the examination. Most animals who had been through that kind of trauma would be hysterical with fear, but this little cat seemed almost serene. She submitted to the examination without protest, purring softly while Dr. Martinez checked her over for injuries and smoke inhalation. Her lungs were clear, which was remarkable given how much smoke she'd been exposed to. Her only injuries were minor burns on her paw pads from the hot windowsill, and even those were already healing. Dr. Martinez said she'd never seen an animal recover from smoke exposure so quickly. I named her Ember, partly because of the fire we'd survived together, and partly because of the way her eyes seemed to glow like tiny coals when the light hit them just right. When I brought her home to my small apartment near the fire station, she explored every room carefully, as if she was making sure this new place was safe before she committed to staying. My apartment was small but comfortable, with large windows that looked out over the city and enough space for a cat to find both sunny spots and quiet hiding places. I had never owned a pet before, and I was nervous about whether I could provide everything she needed. But Ember seemed to understand that we were both figuring things out together. I set up a bed for her in the living room, bought toys and a scratching post, stocked up on the best food the pet store had to offer. But Ember wasn't interested in any of it that first night. Instead, she followed me around the apartment, staying close but not demanding attention, just watching and learning. That first night, she slept curled up on my chest, purring softly, and I could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against mine. It was the same position she'd been in when I carried her out of the burning building, and I think it made both of us feel safe and connected. Her presence was comforting in a way I hadn't expected, a warm weight that seemed to anchor me to something peaceful and good. But Ember's story was just beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things about her that went far beyond typical cat behavior. She seemed to have an almost psychic ability to sense when I was having a difficult day at work. After particularly challenging calls, the ones where we couldn't save everyone, where we arrived too late, where the outcome left us all feeling helpless and sad, she would greet me at the door with extra affection, purring more loudly than usual, staying close to me throughout the evening. It wasn't just coincidence. She could somehow read my emotional state from the moment I walked through the door. If I was upset, she would curl up on my lap and purr until I felt calmer. If I was exhausted, she would lie next to me quietly, providing comfort without demanding attention. If I was restless or anxious, she would follow me around the apartment, a calming presence that helped settle my nerves. When I brought her to the firehouse for the first time, she displayed the same remarkable intuition she'd shown on the night of the fire. She gravitated toward the firefighters who were dealing with stress or emotional challenges, offering comfort in ways that seemed deliberate and purposeful. Lieutenant Johnson, who had been struggling with depression following a failed marriage, found himself spending his breaks sitting with Ember in his lap, stroking her fur and talking to her about his problems. Johnson was a private man who rarely opened up about personal issues, but something about Ember's presence made him feel safe enough to share his pain. He told me later that talking to Ember helped him process emotions he'd been keeping bottled up for months. She didn't judge him or offer advice. She just listened with those remarkable green eyes and purred in response. It was exactly what he needed. A safe space to express his feelings without fear of judgment or professional consequences. Mike Torres, who had been having trouble sleeping due to recurring nightmares about a child he hadn't been able to save the previous year, discovered that Ember's presence in the station helped calm his anxiety. She would seek him out during quiet moments, curling up next to him while he did paperwork or maintained equipment. The nightmares didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent and less intense. Mike said that coming to work and seeing Ember there, calm and content, reminded him that good things could emerge from bad situations, that trauma didn't have to define the rest of your life. Even Captain Martinez, who claimed he wasn't a cat person, admitted that having Ember around made the whole firehouse feel more peaceful and positive. The stress levels that are inevitable in emergency services work seemed to decrease when she was there, and the bonds between crew members grew stronger as they shared the experience of caring for this remarkable little animal. Word of Ember's abilities spread throughout the Denver Fire Department, and soon other stations were requesting visits. What started as informal drop-ins became an official therapy animal program, with Ember and me making scheduled visits to firehouses throughout the city. The impact was immediate and profound. Firefighters who had been reluctant to seek counseling for PTSD or other work-related stress found themselves opening up about their experiences while petting Ember. The stigma around mental health in the fire service began to break down as tough. Experienced firefighters admitted that spending time with this little cat helped them process difficult emotions and traumatic memories. The department's Psychological Services Division started incorporating Ember into their critical incident stress management program. After particularly difficult calls, Ember would visit the crews involved, providing a non-threatening way for firefighters to decompress and begin processing their experiences. But Ember's influence extended far beyond the fire department. The story of her rescue and her subsequent work as a therapy animal caught the attention of local media, and soon she was being featured in newspaper articles and television segments. The Children's Hospital heard about her and asked if she could visit young patients who were dealing with burns or trauma related to fires. The first time I brought Ember to visit burn victims at the hospital, I wasn't sure how she would react to the clinical environment or how the patients would respond to her. But once again, she seemed to know exactly what to do. There was a 7-year-old boy named Tyler who had been severely burned in a house fire 3 weeks earlier. He had been traumatized not just by the physical pain, but by the terror of being trapped in his bedroom while flames surrounded the house. He was having nightmares, refusing to talk to counselors, and becoming increasingly withdrawn from his family and medical team. Tyler's parents had tried everything to help him cope with the trauma. Child psychologists, play therapy, medication. Nothing seemed to reach him. He had built walls around himself that even the most experienced professionals couldn't penetrate. When Ember walked into Tyler's hospital room, she didn't approach him directly. Instead, she sat down a few feet away from his bed and simply watched him with those remarkable green eyes. Tyler stared back at her, and slowly, tentatively, he reached out his bandaged hand toward her. Ember moved closer, carefully avoiding his injuries, and gently rubbed her head against his fingers. Then she began to purr, that same deep, resonant sound I'd heard on the night of the fire. Tyler's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since his accident, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief and connection. Tyler told me later that seeing Ember made him feel less alone, less like the only one who had survived something terrible. Knowing that she had also been through a fire and had come out okay gave him hope that he could heal too, both physically and emotionally. That first visit lasted 2 hours, with Tyler gradually opening up to Ember in ways he hadn't been able to do with adults. He told her about his nightmares, about how scared he was that the fire would come back, about how he missed his bedroom that had been destroyed in the blaze. Ember listened to it all, purring softly and occasionally touching his hand with her paw. By the end of the visit, Tyler was smiling for the first time since the accident. His parents cried when they saw the change in him, and the medical staff was amazed by the breakthrough. The success with Tyler led to a more formal partnership with the hospital's burn unit. Ember began making regular visits to patients of all ages, providing comfort and emotional support during some of the most difficult periods of their recovery. The medical staff reported measurable improvements in patient cooperation, pain management, and overall emotional well-being when Ember was part of their treatment team. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the head of the burn unit, told me that Ember had become an essential part of their healing environment. Patients who were depressed or unresponsive often showed dramatic improvement after spending time with her. Children who were terrified of medical procedures became more cooperative when Ember was allowed to stay in the room with them. But perhaps the most profound impact came from Ember's work with the families of burn victims. Parents who were dealing with guilt and trauma over their children's injuries found comfort in her presence. Siblings who felt forgotten or scared often bonded with Ember in ways that helped them process their own emotions about what their family was going through. One mother, whose teenage daughter had been critically burned in a car accident, told me that Ember had saved her sanity during the worst period of her life. Sitting in the hospital waiting room at 3 a.m., not knowing if her daughter would survive, she found herself talking to Ember about her fears and hopes. The cat's steady presence and gentle purring provided an anchor of calm in the chaos of those terrible days. As Ember's reputation grew, we began receiving invitations to visit other types of facilities. Nursing homes wanted her to comfort elderly residents who were dealing with loneliness and depression. Schools asked her to help children who were struggling with anxiety or behavioral problems. Veterans hospitals requested her services for soldiers dealing with PTSD and other combat-related trauma. Each environment presented different challenges, but Ember seemed to adapt instinctively to whatever situation she encountered. At the nursing home, she would spend hours sitting with residents who rarely had visitors, providing companionship and unconditional love to people who felt forgotten by the world. At the elementary school, she helped anxious children calm down during stressful situations like testing or parent conferences. The veterans' hospital visits were particularly meaningful to me. Many of the soldiers had been injured in explosions or fires during their military service, and they felt an immediate connection to Ember's story of survival. One Marine who had lost both legs in an IED explosion told me that Ember was the first living being who seemed to understand what he had been through, because she had also faced death by fire and lived to tell about it. These experiences taught me something profound about the nature of healing and resilience. Ember didn't just provide comfort to people who were suffering. She provided them with a living example of survival and recovery. Her presence said, without words, that it was possible to survive trauma and not just survive, but thrive and help others in the process. The transformation in my own life was equally dramatic. Before Ember, I had been a competent firefighter who did my job well and went home at the end of each shift. But caring for her and facilitating her therapy work gave my life a deeper sense of purpose and meaning. I was no longer just responding to emergencies. I was helping people heal from the emotional aftermath of those emergencies. I started taking courses in animal-assisted therapy and crisis counseling. I learned about the science behind the human-animal bond and how it could be used therapeutically to help people recover from trauma. I discovered that what I had been witnessing with Ember wasn't just intuition or luck. It was based on real physiological and psychological processes that could be understood and replicated. The act of petting an animal releases oxytocin and endorphins in humans, which reduce stress hormones and promote feelings of well-being. The rhythmic sound of purring has been shown to lower blood pressure and heart rate. The simple presence of a calm, non-judgmental creature can help people feel safe enough to confront difficult emotions and memories. But Ember brought something extra to these interactions, something that went beyond the standard benefits of animal therapy. She seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotional states and respond accordingly. She knew when someone needed energetic play, and when they needed quiet companionship. She could sense the difference between grief and fear, between anger and sadness, and adjust her behavior to provide exactly what each person needed. 5 years have passed since that October night when I rescued Ember from the burning building. She's become something of a local celebrity, with her own social media accounts and regular features in the local news. She has thousands of followers who track her therapy visits and celebrate her successes. She's been featured in national magazines and has even appeared on morning television shows to raise awareness about animal-assisted therapy. But fame hasn't changed her essential nature. She remains the same gentle, intuitive, deeply caring cat she revealed herself to be on that first night. She still sleeps curled up on my chest at night, still greets me at the door when I come home from work, still seems to know exactly when I need her comfort and support. The fire that had brought us together had destroyed an apartment building and displaced dozens of families. But from that destruction had emerged something beautiful and healing. Ember had transformed from a frightened stray cat into a source of hope and comfort for hundreds of people who were facing their own battles with trauma and loss. The program we developed has become a model for other cities. Training manuals have been written, conferences have been held, and hundreds of therapy animals and their handlers have been trained to work with traumatized individuals. The simple idea that animals could provide healing in ways that traditional therapy couldn't has become widely accepted in medical and psychological communities. The apartment building that burned has been rebuilt as a community center that houses programs for trauma survivors and their families. There's a plaque by the entrance that tells the story of the fire and the remarkable cat who emerged from it to become a symbol of hope and resilience. The center offers counseling services, support groups, and animal-assisted therapy programs that serve hundreds of people each year. But the real monument to that night isn't made of bronze or stone. It's the hundreds of lives that have been touched and healed by a little orange cat who learned that survival is just the beginning, and that true healing happens when we find ways to transform our own pain into medicine for others. As I finish telling this story, Ember is curled up next to me, purring softly in that way that still reminds me of the night we first met. Tomorrow, we'll visit the Children's Hospital, where a little girl who was burned in a kitchen accident is waiting to meet her. Next week, we'll go to the Veterans Center, where soldiers who have survived their own fires are learning to build new lives from the ashes of their old ones. But tonight, I'm simply grateful. Grateful for that October night when our paths crossed in the most unlikely circumstances. Grateful for the trust a frightened animal placed in a stranger in protective gear. Grateful for the opportunity to witness the incredible healing power of love in action. The night I rescued Ember from that burning building, I thought I was saving her life. But as the years passed, I realized that she had saved mine in return. She had given me a purpose beyond my job, a mission that extended far beyond putting out fires and rescuing people from immediate physical danger. She had shown me that healing is just as important as rescue, that the work of recovery continues long after the emergency sirens have stopped and the news cameras have gone home. More than that, Ember had taught me about the incredible resilience of the spirit, both human and animal. She had shown me that survival is not just about making it through a crisis, but about finding ways to transform that experience into something that can help others. She had demonstrated that the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for the most meaningful work we ever do. The cat I rescued from a burning building that night taught me the most important lesson of my life: that the act of saving others is what saves us all. And in a world that often feels cold and disconnected, that lesson burns brighter than any fire, warmer than any flame, and more enduring than any building made of brick and mortar. Because love, real love, is the one thing that can never be destroyed.